Friends, Namaskar and very good afternoon learners. I, Dr. Renu Tomor, welcome you back again on the series of lecture on bilingual education. Friends, in the last lecture in the series on bilingual education, if you remember, we left on that how bilingual education is seen in particularly in this case of USA. Now let us try to understand that how and why it was accepted in American schools, so that we have an understanding that how bilingual education is placed in different countries, in different nations. Friends, as far as American schools are concerned, English was not always the language of instruction. In fact, in the 18th century, classes were conducted in German, Dutch, French, Swedish in some school. And particularly if you will have a look at the Peninsula, Maryland and Virginia, that was the language which was taken to. But from the mid-19th century to the early 20th centuries, it was decided that the German should be looked up as a language, and in several cities across the Midwest it was accepted as a language of communication, as a language, as a media of teaching in several schools. In fact, for many years French was also taught and spoken in certain schools, and the Greek was also spoken particularly in the Pittsburgh. So as you can see that there were the different languages which were spoken or which were taught in the school in different states of American. In several cities it was German, in certain cities it was French, then there was also Greek, and in the past, if we have a look in the 18th century, then Dutch, Swedish was also the language which were media of learning or media of teaching. But after the First World War, as the German was prescribed, and after the First World War, it was decided that the German language has to be given up and English has to be taken up. So accordingly, the decisions were taken on education policies, and those policies were made in school, church, city as well as state, and local conditions also determined the local school policy. And in 1968, for the first time, the federal government essentially dictated that non-English speaking children need to be educated in English. So English, which came into being after First World War as accepted as a language, it was decided that the children who were non-English, they had to be worked upon, they should be dictated that they should become English speaking, and the media of education should be kept English. So in simplest term, we would say that immigrants' children needed to learn English so that they can do regular school work for their English speaking classmates and receive an equal educational opportunities, because that was basically the language which was being spoken by the families who were staying in those states. As we have discussed, that in certain states that was the language which was being spoken. So accordingly, English was introduced in those schools as to make them capable, to improve their ability, so that they become of the equal education status as far as the educational level is concerned. They might come at par with the English speaking classmates. So thereon the English was introduced in those schools. In contrary, as we have talked in the previous lecture also, whenever we talk about Europe, multilingualism or bilingualism is seen as a kind of asset. As far as student is concerned, it is seen with extreme positive value, because as we discussed in our previous lecture also, that the child who is studying different languages, he or she would also be having the understanding of culture of those nations. So he would be enabled person as far as culture of those countries is concerned. So that is why that individual is seen in the society, that language is seen in the society as of importance. This is perceived of positive value, and this, friends, is completely in contrast to how it is perceived in America. From why I gave this example? I gave this example as to make you understand that the bilingual education doesn't have a single formula. It differs from one country to another, and it is the situation, the historical perspective which decides why bilingual education has existed or it is existing in those countries. And when it comes to our own nation, we have to pick up bilingual education, or we have to manifest and strengthen bilingual education, because we can't say when we talk in the Indian context that bilingual education does not exist. It does, but we need to strengthen it. For strengthening, we need to understand that how it has been strengthened by the other nations worldwide, and then after having perceived their strength and weaknesses and understood our own situation, the socio-economic situation, after having understood the socio-economic dynamics, we can have bilingualism strengthened in our own nation. Now, let us try to understand what are aims of bilingual education. As far as aims of bilingual education is concerned, first of all, as we understood that it is a tool particularly for the learners who are weak in some particular language. It is a tool for strengthening those students, as it is there in the case of a USA. Then it is also a kind of advantage for the students who are equipped in one language, who are not just socially advantaged but also are brighter in comparison to other peer. For them, it is of advantage, as they will understand the culture, and curriculum prescribed will make them global in the perspective. So, just as in the case of a European country. So, these two are definitely the aims of bilingual education. Other aims of the bilingual education can be, usually it is seen that if we are teaching in a bilingual education, the cognitive development of the child, the affective development of the child, linguistic growth and cultural enrichment, these are the aspects which are advantageous for the children who are studying in bilingual education. Now, friends, let us try to understand that how cognitive development or affective development will be affected if we have bilingual education instead of education in one language. Children are usually comfortable in their own language, the language which is their mother tongue, the language which is spoken to them back home, the language which they usually converse in with their peers. If we are using that language in the class, the understanding will improve. So, that is why we can say that the cognitive development will be faster, because whenever we give example to the child, then naturally those examples, if they are picked up from the real scenario, the real society, the real culture, then naturally the child will be able to understand it better. Just to give you an example, a teacher has to teach Indian marriage. He has to teach about the Indian marriage. She has given a paragraph to all children that write on Indian marriage. Now, friends, despite the fact that the teacher, the medium might be English, but still, अगर टीचर शादी के बारे में हिंदी मीडियम में बच्चों को बताए तो उनका लगाव भी होगा और उनकी समझ भी बढ़ेगी, क्योंकि उनको ये चीज़ अच्छी तरह समझ आएगी कि भारतीय शादी में क्या होता है, किस प्रकार का खाना होता है, किस प्रकार का व्यवहार होता है, किस प्रकार के कपड़े पहने जाते हैं और क्या क्या कल्चरल एंड रीजंस हैं. सो this would be easier for the teacher to teach if she is teaching in the language in which the child is comfortable. Here I talked in Hindi because this is the language I am comfortable with, and I usually the students with whom I interact, they are more comfortable in Hindi. So, Hindi would be picked up by those students easily, and they will be able to correlate, because this topic is about Indian marriage, and nobody, when they go to the Indian marriage, they converse in English. Of course, they converse in the mother tongue, the language in which they are comfortable. So, if we discuss the issues and topics also in that language, then the student will be able to understand. That is why usually whenever we used to talk about English language teaching, we used to say that a translation method should never be adopted. But in certain cases, translation method is very effective, as in the case of this particular topic which I have cited. When the child is wants to write about the Indian marriage, then naturally if the teacher is utilizing the translation method, that means talking in Hindi and then talking in English about the same aspect, giving the vocabulary needed to the child so that the child can develop his write-up on the Indian marriage. So, here the translation method can be adopted, and of course, whenever we will talk about translation method, what is it, friends? It is multilingual, it is bilingual. So, this teaching here which we are talking about in the class is bilingual. Now, friends, let us talk about how affective development would be there. What is affective development? It is about the aesthetic sense. Aesthetic sense is related to the culture, and the culture is related to the language. The child is understanding the culture, listening to that culture in the language which is spoken around him, back home or with their peer group. So, naturally, affective development also will be strengthened if, as a teacher, we would be discussing in the language in which the child is comfortable. If you are a teacher in say Tamil Nadu, and the child is more comfortable in the language, the place where you are staying, there the child have Tamil speaking students, then naturally the Tamil language should be used in the class. If there are Hindi speaking students, then the Hindi speaking language should be used in the class. Apart from that, only then the linguistic growth will be there. So, friends, from here on, let us try to understand the other goals or the other aspects of the bilingual. Friends, it has also been seen, this is a very important and very interesting point, that a child who is good at his own mother tongue is also usually seen to be picking up the foreign language better. That means acquisition of English language or any other foreign language can be enriched if we have linguistically and culturally manifested environment in the class in which the mother tongue is not just introduced but also utilized. So, the value of linguistic and cultural diversity will be promoted in case of a bilingual society, in case of bilingual education system. Friends, from here on, what we understand is that bilingual education has more advantages than disadvantages, but we also need to understand what kind of disadvantages does the bilingual education has. This is also a very important aspect which we should be understanding. Before coming to the disadvantage, there are few more advantages which we should be understanding. That whenever we talk about the bilingual education, there has to be something in the mainstream. What is there in the mainstream? In the mainstream will be maintenance of the native culture. That is the most important aspect. Whenever we will talk about the bilingual language, the central theme of bilingual education program would be maintenance of the native culture and transition of the student to the mainstream, covering the aspect which is correlated to it, but still being able to understand one's own culture well, one's own language well, one's own aesthetic values well. So, this is the most important aspect of bilingual language. And one important thing, friends, which we need to discuss is that whenever we talk about critical thinking, which is the language we are comfortable in? Usually the language which we have practiced, the language, and which is the language which we have practiced most? The language which we have spoken most. Which is the language which we have spoken most? The language which was introduced to us as a mother tongue. So, even when we talk about developing critical thinking, then also we need to understand that the bilingual education is at advantage, because the child is viewing the world through that media, that particular language. So, critical thinking can also be developed if we are propagating, promoting bilingual education. So, friends, from here on what we understand is that the media of instruction should be bilingual. One, it should not be one language, and apart from that, academic achievement of the subject area can also be decided by the comfort of the child. For the example which we gave in our previous lecture was the social science. In case of a social science, generally it is introduced to the children in their own language, may it be the Hindi, may it be the other language, Marathi, because that is the language in which the child is not just comfortable but also at ease. So, that is one thing which is at the focus. Now, let us try to understand that whenever we talk about the bilingual education, what is the difference between second language teaching and bilingual teaching? Second language teaching, I would say, is one of a type of bilingual education, because here also the aim is to develop another language as to increase the understanding of the child of the culture of different of the country in which that language is spoken. For example, if the child is studying Spanish, or the child is studying French, or the child is studying Mandarin, then what do we expect from the child? That the child should also be knowing about the Chinese culture. The child who is studying Mandarin should be knowing about the Chinese culture. Similarly, the child who is studying French should be well versed with the art and cultural aspect of France. And if we have just have the child speaking in that language and having no understanding of the culture or the art of that particular country, we would say that it is that the child is half educated. So, let us try to understand that whenever we talk about two language formula or the three language formula, that also is one of the aspect of bilingual, because that is also aiming at linguistically developing the child understanding of the foreign language. So, from here on what we have understood is that the bilingual education is not so simple as it is seen to be, and definitely it is different from the bilingualism, and it is definitely different from the second language teaching or the third language teaching. So, it is actually the bilingual education is basically decided by how those languages are to be used, how those two languages or three languages are to be used. This is what the bilingual education is about. That is at the core area. That is why it is very complex, and it can be understood by the different people in different way. So, if we will talk in one line that what bilingual education is, then we would say that bilingual education is different from bilingualism, because bilingualism aims at that the two languages should be spoken in the classroom, but bilingual education means that the discussions, the content, even that can be filtered as per the medium of education. So, bilingual education is very different and very complex, and it is different from bilingualism. In the next lecture, we will be talking about the myths or the prejudice which have grown around bilingualism or multilingualism. We would also be discussing about the disadvantage which bilingual education can have in case it is not applied well. So, friends, on this note, I take your leave. So, Dr. Renu Tomar signing off, with the promise to meet you again on the third part of the series of bilingual education as to cover the left out aspects of bilingual education. Namaskar, good afternoon, have a good